Awesome. So let me make sure I can still see all of your faces, all your pictures at least. Awesome. So today's talk is entitled Empowering Change, Advancing Women in Engineering through Equity Catalyst. I consider this conversation to be a catalyst for equity, but I also know that empowerment is a long-term thing. So I'm hoping that these skills will help us on our journeys. And I'm not at all hoping that like the whole experience of women in engineering will be completely different as a function of this talk, right? I'm just hoping to give some tools and also hoping to start some conversations. I am an educator by trade. My PhD is in engineering education. So I think a lot about how people learn difficult things. And as much as engineering is super technical and difficult, a lot of times the social component of things is even more complicated, right? So with that being said, I know and I would prefer to do a lot more of an engaging kind of conversation where you're talking to each other. But we only have 2 hours today. Also, I'm very aware of kind of the professional relationships that exist. So I didn't want to create any conversations or spaces that I wouldn't be able to completely contain in this space. So I'm not going to be as collaborative as I would like to be. We're not going to be doing any breakout rooms, but we will have a few opportunities for you to reflect and for you to engage, okay? So I just wanted to put that out there because I know a lot of times, we experience different Zoom settings. So here are our objectives for today. We're going to reflect first on our own biases, and we're also going to recognize some of the obstacles that might be impacting women in engineering. We're also going to address the concept of intersectionality, this idea of multiple discriminations, and how unconscious bias might show up. And then we're going to try to promote some organizational change by allowing you all to create some action plans and beginning to foster what a creative and supportive network might be. Before we get too deep in it, I did want to introduce myself, even though Liz did an amazing job. I am Dr. Chanel Beebe. I am an engineer by trade, so my bachelor's and master's degrees are in industrial engineering. My PhD is in engineering education. I identify as African-American and Indigenous woman. So I'm born and raised in Detroit. I have roots in Mississippi in the South, and I also have roots in Ghana in Africa. I identify as two-spirited, which is a Native American gender identity. The quickest way to describe it would be it's kind of the opposite of non-binary, right? So instead of saying I'm neither masculine or feminine, I actually embody both of those. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that might mean, but I did want to give you some introduction to me. My pronouns are she, hers. I haven't put it in my name, but I do appreciate those of you who have labeled yourself as such. I'm also accompanied by an awesome friend and colleague of mine by the name of Megan. I'll give you a second to introduce yourself, Megan.
Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Pollock, and Chanel and I are friends from grad school, and we've been able to collaborate quite a bit over the years. And so I'm just in the background today to support her. And so you can reach out and message me directly if you have any questions. And I bring a similar lived experience professionally as Chanel, coming from an engineering background as well. And then I get to the privilege of getting to do this kind of work for a living. So I'm here to be Chanel's cheerleader today.
Yes, thank you so much. So if there are any questions that you have and I'm not responding quick enough, feel free to message Megan as well. We are communicating in the back channel, so we'll make sure we get all your questions addressed. Okay, so for today, I'm asking that you bring a few things. The first is an open and reflexive mind. I know that showing up can be difficult, especially on a Friday afternoon. So I ask that you just keep your mind as open as possible, but also as introspective as you can be, thinking about your experiences. If you can, find yourself in a relatively distraction-free space, that would be great, just so you're able to engage fully. But I understand that life happens. So if you need to step away to use the restroom or to address something, completely understood. No need to ask permission or even let us know, handle what you need to handle in the background. Ideally, you do have a computer that you can use or a tablet. We will be using some some Google Drive spaces, as well as a Jamboard. And sometimes it's difficult to access those things mobilely and to be able to type and contribute. So that's just a heads up. And then this is our agenda for today. So you've seen the objective, and this is how I really hope that we'll be able to address those objectives. So first, we're going to talk about some biases and obstacles that exist. We're going to give some language to intersectionalities and the things that come up related to those things. And then we're going to start to think about what do we need to know, or what do we need to be able to identify in our experiences. And then lastly, we're going to do some networking to be able to really start to build community across this group, but also to identify who else could we be talking to, who else could we be partnering with to make some change as it relates to the experiences of women in engineering. Okay. So I want to welcome you all into the space. I know that this can feel like a very intellectual experience, but your brain is a part of your body. So I'm going to ask you all to engage with your body first. So let's first start by taking a deep breath. If we can do so together, that would be great. I'm going to ask you to inhale in your nose, hold it for a few seconds, and exhale out your mouth. Let's do that together. Inhale and exhale. One more time. Let's inhale together, hold it for a couple seconds, and exhale. I wanted us to be able to share a breath together, but also to share some awkward silences. A lot of this work involves letting things be awkward, but also involves just being present with what your body is going through. Showing up in these kind of spaces can be difficult, and I think the more that we can kind of engage our nervous system, the better. So before we get too deep into this, I did want to kind of establish some guidelines. We're going to be doing a little bit of collaborative conversation today, and I want to make sure that we at least have the intention to be as respectful and inclusive as possible. I also know that this is a learning space, right? So sometimes we don't know exactly what to say or how to say it, and that's fine. Is anybody familiar with the term or the phrase I statements? If you could raise your hand. I statements, yeah. So I statements can be really helpful. That's essentially trying to avoid having to speak for entire groups or speak for entire ideas and just say, this has been my experience, right? Especially as it relates to experiences of bias or discrimination. It can be really helpful to just speak from your own perspective, right? So I invite you all to make as many I statements as you'd like today. Also invite us to think about the way that we're contributing and what we're contributing, right? So this idea of stepping up and stepping back essentially means that if I notice I've been contributing a lot, I'm going to be aware of that and step back a little bit. If I notice that I've been quiet or not contributing, I'm going to push myself to step forward. Okay, so that's step up, step back. There's also this idea of people first. I know, like I said, this can be very intellectual. Some of these concepts are super core to our identities. So let's try to be as empathetic as we can with the humans experiencing these things. But also we want to make sure that as we're engaging, we're challenging ideas and not people, right? So we want to make sure that we are considerate of the people who are sharing these things and considering the way that we're engaging with them. And lastly, and this one can be complicated, but remember that what we're talking about is not just intellectual, it's not just personal, anecdotal. There are structures and systems of power that make these things happen. In designing this, I actually was really considerate of the fact that, you all are colleagues in some way, or you work in the same university system. So I didn't want to try to design breakout sessions and assume that everybody would just contribute vulnerably. Because there are power structures and power dynamics that are at play. So we're going to try to be as respectful as we can and try to use this as a jumping board for more engagement. Okay. Any questions about these guidelines or anything that anyone would like to add? So first, we're going to talk about showing up, and especially when it's difficult. I think it's easy to take for granted what it means to show up because professionally we get paid to show up, right? So you just have to do it. But it can be sometimes difficult. I did want to share my story. So like I mentioned, I am an engineer by trade. And this is actually a picture of me when I was graduating from my first engineering degree. And showing up in that degree program was not always simple. Not only was I an African-American student at a predominantly white institution, but also was I was a woman engaging in a very male-dominated field. And I had a couple experiences initially that did make it difficult for me to show up sometimes. I remember when I first started my engineering program, I was in my first engineering class. It was 9 in the morning on a Tuesday, and our professor was putting us in groups, and he had us counting off, 1 through 4. I think I was sitting in the front row, and I think I got like a number 2 or something. And the count continued to go. And then behind me, I heard some students talking, and they were kind of looking and seeing who was going to be in their group. And I remember one student was like, "Oh man, I got a girl in my group." And it kind of hit me in the gut. I was like, is that a thing that we consider? Like, what does that mean? But for me, from that moment, it became very apparent to me that my gender was doing something in this engineering space, right? That other people were perceiving my gender positively or negatively, but also that was something that I could consider. I obviously was able to matriculate. I graduated, right? But that did make showing up a little interesting and a little difficult. As I continued through grad school, these things continued to become real, right? I noticed the way my voice was experienced by my advisors or my classes. I noticed how my ideas had a little bit more weight to them when I had certain people able to say them for me. And I think all of us have different experiences that do affect how we show up, right? Today, we're specifically going to focus on the gender component of those things, but as we'll mention and as we'll unpack, a lot of different identities can affect how we show up, right? It can be our gender, it can be our race, it can be our upbringing, it can be our religion, it can be political, right? It can be our conception of what engineering is even for in the first place, right? So though we're talking a lot about gender and how it affects our ability to show up, I do want to make sure we bring into the space this idea that all of us have different identities that might affect how we show up and what that looks like. So that's a little bit about my story. I know for me, as it relates to these topics of gender, there are a lot of things that make it hard to show up. So there are this concept of gender biases, which is the tendency to give preferential treatment to one gender over another. Obviously, experience different in different industries, but as we know in engineering, it's a very male-dominated field, right? And sometimes these things can happen subconsciously. And that experience has been researched and understood as unconscious bias. So these are systemic but flawed patterns of responses and judgments and decision and problem based on things that we're not completely aware of, right? And if you're not aware of it, how do you deal with it? How do you notice it? And that's some things we're going to address today. There's also this idea of stereotypes, right? So these characteristics that we impose on groups of people because of their identity. So women tend to be X or men tend to be Y. Or, people who look like this tend to be really good at this specific type of engineering or this specific type of engagement. And those stereotypes, though, I think they're helpful for, your brain and your pattern recognition. They're experienced in really weird ways sometimes. And I think we're all a little familiar with that. One topic that I think is under discussed is this idea of systemic obstacles, right? So these are intentional and unintentional coordinations of these biases or these stereotypes that lead to discrimination or really denigrate the experiences or the contributions that people might have socially and professionally. We're not going to get super deep into like the historical reasons why these things exist, but I did want to give you some language to use to talk about either what your experiences have been, or to talk about what you would like to see done differently. Okay. I'm also aware that, we're coming to the space kind of blind. Like, I'm not going to assume that you all know each other really well. I'm also not going to assume that you all have super deep experiences with engaging with these topics. So if these topics are new to you, feel free to take a moment to take them in. But also don't be ashamed of what you don't know, right? Continue to ask questions, continue to engage. So just a reminder about what our objectives are. We're going to start by really understanding how can we recognize these things. I want to make sure you have space to reflect as we go along. So I will ask that if you have like a notebook or a document open, that you reflect there. Also, I'm going to make the chat function available. So if you would like to respond to any of these things through chat, you can do that to the whole group, or you can also message me directly. We also will have some Jamboard. So we're going to share some links in a second where you can actually put your thoughts onto Post-it notes and we can see those collectively. However, I don't want to assume that everybody's comfortable sharing, right? So especially this last function, that's optional. So if you don't feel comfortable sharing your responses to the questions I asked as a group, that's completely understandable. I would encourage you to do so because we might be able to learn from those things, but you have your personal notebook so you can keep up with what you're understanding, what you're reflecting on your own. You also can chat to me directly so that everybody can't see it. So those are your options. So to make sure, this is a kind of play as you will space. So please don't feel the need to be super vulnerable with people you don't know or super vulnerable with people that you'll have to continue to work with. I did want to start with a quick reflection. So thinking about some of the topics that I just brought up, what have your experiences been? What have you witnessed? And then what causes have you been able to identify? So as we think about the experiences of women in engineering, this idea of bias, this idea of discrimination is often something that shows up in really weird ways. So I do want to give you a moment to think about what your experiences have been, or maybe what you were witnessed with your colleagues or with your students. And I'd ask that you would write that down. Thinking about it is beautiful, but once you start to give it words, it takes on a little bit of a deeper life. So Megan's just dropped a link in the chat to our first Jamboard. This is our opening reflection. If you click on that link, you'll find a screen that looks like this. Alyssa's joined. So thinking about our objectives today, what have been your direct experiences? And if you click on these post-it notes, you should be able to just add text there. And every page of this Jamboard has a different question. So what have you experienced? What have you witnessed? And what causes can you identify? So I'm going to just give us maybe about 5 minutes just to reflect. I know I've been talking a lot. I know I've given you a lot of concepts to think about. So reflect on these questions. The first question might be kind of hard if you don't want to unpack something that's been traumatic. Remember that that's optional. You can start thinking about the experiences of other people. But I do want to make sure we all have some time to kind of bring our own experiences and our own perspectives into the space. Megan, is it possible for you to share music while I'm sharing screen?
No, but I can share screen with a timer and some music.
I believe in you. Let's do that. All right, so we're gonna give people about 5 minutes to reflect. Let's go until 1:31 your time. We'll just watch the timer. It looks like the first page just got deleted, so I'm just gonna recreate it. I have about 2 minutes left. If you've already reflected on your experiences, think about the other questions. So what have you witnessed, or what are some of the causes to some of the biases or the discrimination that you think is experienced? I want to make sure you have time to think about all three of the questions. All right, so take a moment to wrap up your thoughts. I know these are deep and sometimes often emotional questions, so if you need more time, feel free to take that time. If you're done reflecting, please take some time to review what other people have added. So for the sake of time and also just for our collective psychological safety, I'm going to kind of reflect back what I see, and we will have opportunities for more engagement across the participants in a second. But in terms of the experiences that I see you all sharing, there are a lot of gendered experiences that we've had, right? So I've seen some responses related to, seeing a 30-person classroom in an engineering class and there's only one female student. Or hearing other professors describe female students as too emotional, right? Or feeling like there's the weight of your entire gender identity on your shoulders, right? Like you have to be the best at what you do because you are a woman. I also see some things around seeing other people get promoted over you, even though you have the experience, or having to train other people to do jobs that you're capable of. I'm seeing some things related to the publication process and this idea that sometimes women are scrutinized harder than other people. So firstly, thank you all for your vulnerability and your honesty, but also thank you for taking the time to kind of deeply reflect on what you've seen. What I find interesting is in the causes responses, right? So it's often really difficult to think through systemically what caused these things, right? Because there are so many social and historical components of it. But one thing that came up from you all's responses is that this idea that the history of engineering is militaristic, right? So this idea that engineering was initially designed as a civilian component to the army, and in a lot of ways, the education thereof was designed for male students. And I've studied this a little bit, and I will say that there are a lot of historic and systemic things that create engineering education as we know it. There's definitely the military component of it, but there's also this capitalistic component and this idea that the degree that you're getting, the degree that we're training students to get, is inherently transactional, and therefore students should only engage from an intellectual point of view, and that can be difficult and also exclusionary for people who are trying to bring their whole selves, right? And to me, I think a lot of the reason why we experience sometimes women students and women faculty as overly emotional is because we don't have space for emotions in our conception of what our discipline is, right? We think that this is supposed to be an intellectual thing, so why are feelings getting involved? When in reality, who we are as people can really contribute to the way that we do the work and the work that we do. I do want to just hold some space where if there's anything else that people want to add. So if you want to add that in the chat or add that to the board, I'm going to give you a moment to do that. If you're done, I also would like you to take some stock right now about how your body feels, right? As we're thinking about some of these uncomfortable experiences. If you can drop a word in the chat around what it felt like to do that reflective activity. Are you uncomfortable? Are you feeling very light? Are you tight? Where's your mind at right now? So if you can drop a word in the chat, just one word, how you're feeling. See some tightness in the chest. Just reading facial expressions, a lot of you look very pensive, right? Like you're deep in thought. It's kind of taking you to a reflective spot. Mixed feelings, a bit emotional. Free, okay. Apprehensive but open. Yeah, it is a very tenuous space to be. So I don't want to push us out of the space too quickly. I also don't want to linger here too long, right? Because I'm not a therapist. I don't want to make you all think that I can make it all okay. I can't. It's just uncomfortable, and that's a part of what this is. Okay, so let's do a collective deep breath together. I'm going to inhale on the count of 3 and then exhale. But as we inhale, I want us to inhale all the frustrations, all the confusion. And as you exhale, I want us to exhale this idea that this is a problem that we can solve right now, right? We're going to exhale this desire to fix it or this desire to change it. Okay, so on the count of 3, we're going to inhale, all the complications. I'm going to exhale the need to change and need to fix. I'm going to inhale all the pain and all the trauma. And I'm going to exhale the need to fix and need to change. One more time on your own. Take a deep breath. And exhale. So one of the most complicated things about engaging with these experiences is that it's often really hard to do anything about it because we don't necessarily know what the causes are. And I know we're all engineers and we can think systemically, but there are social ways that we can think systemically as well. I really appreciate this concept of intersectionality because I think it gives us a way to name the complications associated with our experience. As we think about engineering education, for example, it doesn't necessarily just exist in the classroom, right? There's this historical component, there's capitalism, there are funding deadlines, there are requirements. There are a lot of things that make these things a little bit more complicated. Can you raise your hand for me if you've ever heard of the concept of intersectionality? Okay, it's gotten a little bit more popular. Awesome. Does anybody want to take a stab at describing what intersectionality is or what it means? Raise your hand or unmute yourself. I know that's a loaded question, right? People are like, no, I don't want to try to do that. I might say it wrong. I might do it wrong.
Yes, I'll try. It's multiplicity of identities and just experiences. So it's not just that you're one gender or one racial group, but it's the way that those dance with each other.
Exactly. That was perfect. Yanika, thank you so much for sharing that. Yes. So this is one of my favorite visuals for intersectionality. As they mentioned originally, I'm an artist, so it's important for me to have visuals. And for me, this summarizes the complication of trying to understand these type of things. So yes, race comes to play, ethnicity, but also everything else, right? So the language, your class, your mental health, your concept of what the world should be. All these things create really complicated ways to understand things. So intersectionality is a lens at which you can see how power comes and how it collides, right? So this idea that individual experiences or different types of discrimination don't necessarily just exist because of one identity, but the fact that they are a combination of a lot of them, right? So if we think about this conversation, for example, we're talking about gender biases as it relates to engineering, right? Engineering comes with its own intersectionality of identities. So engineering in and of itself is a relatively privileged identity, right? It's something that can help you transcend class. It's something that controls the way resources are created and shared. So it doesn't end up just a like, oh, if students are able to feel comfortable, they can therefore be engineers. It's like, well, what does engineering mean in terms of the power in society? But as we think about it for ourselves as faculty members and as teachers, the way that these things play out impacts more than just how we show up at work, right? It impacts the power that we have in our lives. It impacts the things that we're able to create for future generations. So as we think about the space between intersectionality and what our experiences have been and the things that we've witnessed, it gets really complicated, right? So as we think about the experiences that we see for students or the experiences that we have for ourselves, these things matter, not just because we're engineers or not just because we're faculty member, they matter because we're whole people who have goals, hopes, ideas, and things that we like to see in the world. And I think a lot of times when we address these conversations, we try to just have one conversation, right? Because it's easiest, because it feels the most systemic. And also because as engineers, we have this idea that any problem we can solve, right? Anything that we put our minds to, we can use the scientific process and get to the bottom of it. But as it relates to social issues, it's not always that simple, right? It immediately becomes like a differential equation with, multivariate calculus if you really are considering the truth of what the multiple identities might be. Intersectionality is also a reason why the unconscious bias can be really difficult to see, right? Because you might say, well, I have this gender identity or I have this experience, or I've done a lot to understand and to be more equitable as it relates to gender, but you might not be considering other identities of yours, right? So I know for me, when I started doing this work, what slapped me in the face was like, oh, wait, I am an American-born citizen who speaks English, and I don't consider how these things might be more complicated if I was not American, right? Or if I was not a part of the dominant culture in a few different ways. So I'm not asking that we understand all this today. I'm not asking that we even are able to describe what we're experiencing through these lenses. But I do think it's important to remember and to know that the intersectionality of our identities affects what we witness, right? It affects what we experience. It also affects the causes that we can identify and the work that we can do in that space. Okay. Now, here comes the fun part, right? So thinking about, now that we know that these obstacles and these biases exist, we also know that they happen because of intersectional lenses. What and how can we be aware of, and how can we start to mitigate these things? The idea of unconscious bias is, I think, something that we've heard a lot of, and I don't want to spend too much time, beating a dead horse and making sure you know the words associated with these things. But in case you haven't heard of it, unconscious bias, also known as implicit bias, refers to unconscious forms of discrimination, stereotyping based on any of your identities, right? So this can be gender-based, this can be ability status, this can be nationality. And it shows up in a lot of really weird ways, right? As we think about our matriculation through being faculty members, when we are working on our tenure packages, when we're working on different grants, we are running into the unconscious bias of the people we're working with, people who have power over us, but also our collaborators, right? And sometimes it can be difficult to learn how to navigate those things. So this is a source that I've gotten from this HR website that I think they do a great job of breaking things down. But these are 5 types of unconscious bias that we see in the workplace. I'll give you a second to read the slide because I know we're all scholars who can read. So I'll give you a moment to take a look at that. So let's do a show of hands here. If you've heard of all 4 of these before, please raise your hand. All 4? Okay. What about 3 of them if there's only one that you're completely new to? Okay. 2, if 2 of them are familiar and 2 are new. Okay. And if only one of them you've heard of before. Okay. For those of you who only heard of one of them before, which one are you familiar with?
Confirmation bias?
Okay. Yeah. I think as engineers, it's important for us to be aware of that one, right? We don't want to be doing research and only finding what we want to find. Which one stands out the most to you? If anybody wants to share, which one is like, oh, I never thought of that, or oh, this doesn't sound right.
I hadn't heard of halo horns before. It's very insightful.
Yeah. So technically those are 2 different effects. And if you look at the link, they're going to have them separated, but I didn't want to crowd the slide. But they're the same, 2 sides to the same coin, right? So this idea that if you already think or perceive of someone as good as they do stuff, you're going to be like, oh, that's because they're inherently a good person. And the same as the opposite, right? If I think somebody is bad as they do things, it'll be easier for me to find the bad things. What about attribution bias? To me, it kind of connects to the halo horns and the confirmation bias. Does anyone want to give an example or have some thoughts related to attribution bias?
Can you expand on it? I'm not quite getting it from the blurb.
Okay. So the blurb just says it affects how we assess other people and their achievements. And this is really the idea that if we respect someone's identity overall, we will attribute the good things they do to their identity. So this person is getting this award because they're just good at their thing, right? They're just really good at this, they deserve it. But if we don't already perceive them as valuable or worthy of it, if they get something, we're like, oh, they got that as a fluke, or they got that, because they know somebody. It's like we start to attribute the things that they do with the kind of person they are, as opposed to really, what the work might be, or even being able to look at that with an intersectional lens. And I think, yeah, in an engineering space, this is really connects to this idea of meritocracy. Has anyone heard that word before? Engineering being like, oh, you are good because you study really hard and you deserve everything that comes to you. That's a mental bias. And then there's affinity bias, right? So this is kind of it's easier for us to favor people who have similar backgrounds as us, who look like us, who sound like us. And this is something that I think is really hard to overcome, especially because a lot of our networks and our understanding of community comes from the people we're working with, right? But if you're working with people who are easy for you to work with, over time, you'll find that there's a lot of similarities, you know, and I've noticed this in my work as well. Like a lot of my clients happen to be Black women. And I don't think that's accidental, right? In a lot of ways, that's because we're already comfortable with each other. So these biases are not inherently bad, right? They're just something that we need to know about. And they're really natural and helpful, right? Sometimes it's good for our brain to have a kind of cheat code of what to know about so we can easily identify threats, we can easily identify possible allies. But over time, if these things are unchecked, they can lead to skewed experiences, right? So if we think about ourselves as a collective, ourselves as a network that could be working together, if we're only really working with people who look like us or people we already think are good, there's a whole section of people that aren't being included. And there's also a whole section of ideas and ways of thinking that are not being included in our work, right? Which can limit the impact of our work and the overall quality as well. So I know these might be new concepts. I did want to give you some examples of how these might show up in the workplace. We talked about some of the things related to attribution bias, but when we think about affinity bias, who you network with and how, right, might be affected by who you're comfortable with, who you already associate goodness with, who you choose to collaborate with, right? There might be some professors that have great work, but because you're not really sure about them, you don't know them, you haven't taken the time to unpack them, you might decide not to work with them. It also shows up a lot in hiring and promotion. When we think about engineering as an institution, it being full of men or it being full of a certain type of men is not completely accidental, right? It might not be something that people have done intentionally, but there's a lot of affinity bias that happens in even sharing job postings in the first place, right? Or kind of that idea of it being like a old boy network. And if you want more examples of these, Megan is dropping some examples in the chat. I want to give you a moment just to kind of think about this and also to review what Megan has put in the chat. So now, we've talked about it. I've talked about it, right? You've been listening to me. I want to give you a moment to reflect on these things for yourself, right? So thinking about, have you ever caught yourself making assumptions based on someone's appearance or their background? Can you recall a specific situation where your unconscious bias kind of influenced your actions? Obviously, if it was unconscious, you weren't aware of it beforehand, right? So has to be like a hindsight kind of reflection. And then the last question is, how do you think your unconscious bias might affect your interactions with others in your workplace or in any relevant context? So Megan has just dropped a link in the chat to a second Jamboard. If you click on that link, you should be able to get to it. It's going to be set up similar to the first one. It's going to allow you to, why am I signed up? Okay. To think about, first, have you caught yourself making assumptions based on people's background or their appearance? Secondly, any situations where you notice that your unconscious bias was influencing your actions? And then third, how have your interactions been affected? As much as I would love us to think about this within an academic context, thinking about your peers, you can also think about your students, right? In a situation where you make some assumptions about your students, maybe based on how they look, but more likely based on maybe how they've been performing, right? You thought the student was not engaging, turns out they were. But you can also think about this in your personal life, right? I know some of us might have children, I might have people we mentor, and we might notice that we had some predisposed assumptions about them. So I want to give you, this time I'm gonna give you about 10 minutes, I think, yes, to think about these questions. I know thinking about unconscious bias takes a minute. So we're gonna give you 10 minutes to think. Feel free to use the Jamboard if you feel comfortable. You also can message me directly, or you can just keep it to yourself personally, because I know sometimes your first time thinking about this, you might not want the whole world to know, and that's completely okay. Megan's gonna play some music. If you're still struggling with any of these concepts or you're struggling with any of these questions, feel free to message us as well, and we can provide some additional clarity. I'm seeing the activity in the Jamboard slow down a little bit. Just want to do a temperature check. If you are still working or still thinking, can you either raise your hand or drop something in the chat? If you're done, you don't have to say or do anything. Okay. So maybe let's do just one more minute for people to wrap up, and then we'll come back together. It's like folks might have hit a wall with their reflection, and that is okay. Mm. So let's come back together. So firstly, thank you all so much for your vulnerability and your transparency so far, but also for your patience, because I know that these conversations sometimes, they might feel like they're dragging on or you get it already, but it's really good and important to kind of take our time with these things. So what I'm seeing in the Jamboard are a few different experiences of assumptions. Um, I think the most comical to me, and this is not at all to minimize, but one I think is interesting and would make a great moment in a TV show, is the shoddy guy in a restaurant who turns out to be the owner, right? So you think somebody might not even belong there, and it turns out that they own the place, right? So that's just kind of, sometimes our biases are not really lining up with reality. I also see a few about making some snap judgment about people. So this idea of like asking a Black student if they're an athlete, right? Just your brain is already associating, and it comes out your mouth and you're kind of embarrassed. I'm glad to see that the anonymity feature of this is helpful. I did want to make sure that you all didn't feel like your name had to be associated with you learning these things. And also, I see some around like childcare, right? And this is an assumption that people might be making around if somebody has to deal with kids or not based on their age, and that being something that you have to navigate. When we think about the second question, so looking at situations in which your bias might be influencing your actions, somebody brought up this idea of negative bias, right? So this idea that you're assuming that maybe the white males you work with might not X, Y, and Z, so you're acting a little differently. And that's also a great example of bias, right? This usually comes from some trauma or some previous experience where you haven't felt welcome, so you assume that somebody won't welcome you, right? That's a very real experience. I'm not going to offer like too deep of a solution there, but I do appreciate you for sharing that nuance of experience. And then ways that our biases might be interacting or affecting our interactions. One that I thought was interesting was this idea of how we play into the bias, right? I think somebody put this in the first question, but this idea that I am wearing suits or doing things so that people won't have bias against me, right? So I'm trying to portray myself as more professional so that I don't have to run into other people's bias. But also this idea of like you're looking out for mistakes so that you won't confirm somebody else's bias. And that's a really good example of what we call a stereotype threat. So this idea that you're aware that people have stereotypes of you and you don't want to play into that stereotype. So you go out of your way to present yourself as better, smarter, or more competent. And that unfortunately happens a lot and takes a lot of energy, right? If you're thinking about other people's biases. I don't want to minimize any of the things that you shared, and I also don't want to move on from this too quickly. So if anybody has anything else they would like to add, feel free to do so. And if anybody has anything they want to share with the group, I wanted to make some space for that as well at this point. not see anybody unmute themselves. So I do know that some people have to hop a little bit early, and if you have to do so, I completely understand. I want to make space for that. Before you go, I just want to give you a preview of what we're going to be covering so you know what to come back to. But also for those of us who are staying on, I want to let you know what's coming up. So we're going to be talking about some quick ways to mitigate bias and unconscious awareness and unconscious bias and awareness. We're also going to do an activity where we can think about how we might strategically develop community around these things. But we are about halfway through our time. So I do want to give you all a moment to take a break and take a break from now until 2:05. And then we're going to jump back into things. So if you want to go to the restroom, just take a minute to breathe. Let's do that now. Okay. Megan, if you could play some music, that would be great. Okay, so welcome back. Thanks, Megan. So, I hope you all had a beautiful break, or at least a moment to take a breath. If you were not able to join for the first half and you're here now, welcome. So though we're about halfway through our time, we're actually about 75% of the way through the content, right? So the rest of this should be a lot more engaging for you all. It's going to be a little bit less of me giving you definitions and a little bit more of you being able to think about what you'd like to do for yourself. Before we jump back into things, I would like to just do a temperature check. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you feeling right now, coming back from break? This could be in relation to our material. It could just be, you know, I got a lot going on today, so this is great, but I'm still a little disengaged. See 8s, 10s. If you are feeling relatively low, you don't want people to know, you can hold that to yourself, or you can send me a message privately. Okay. So far, 7s to 10s. I think I'm doing, I would say like probably somewhere between 6 and 8. I know 6 is kind of low. The 8 is more so because I'm present with you all, but I do have things happening in my personal life. I'm like in the process of applying for jobs, and right before this, I got like 3 different rejection letters because it's Friday and people send their final things at once. I also think it's a little bit related to just like the topic that we're talking about, right? This is not the happiest type of thing to be talking about. So I'm going to be leaning on you 8s and 10s to bring my 6 up a little bit. No pressure, no pressure. So, you know, previously on this workshop, we were talking about our experiences of unconscious bias, right? And this idea that there's a lot of different biases that exist, but also that they're hard to understand because of intersectionality. I do want to give a few tips around what you can do to mitigate unconscious bias, but I'm going to go through this relatively quickly because I think this is something that's going to take time for you to sit with anyway. And I do want to make sure that we have time for you all to do the activity that we design, okay? So let's put on our seatbelts and get ready to move kind of quickly, okay? Okay, I'm going to share screen again. Oops, wrong button. So how do we mitigate unconscious bias, right? It's something that we're not aware of. So how can you address something that you can't even mentally wrap your head around? So a quick spoiler alert, it takes long-term commitment, right? This is one of those wicked problems that is not something that can be solved in the afternoon. There will be some blunders along the way. So I encourage you to do whatever you need to do to nourish yourself, to keep yourself confident, but also to keep yourself present and okay with failure. A few of you I've worked with before, and I just want to shout out Liz as somebody who I think has embodied the tenacity and resilience it takes to continue to do this work, right? It's not, there isn't really a point where you become an expert. And even, you know, your position, your identities don't prevent you from being discriminatory, don't prevent you from holding some of these unconscious biases. So as you are engaging on this journey, please know that the discomfort that you feel is common and it's going to be consistent. And I think, you know, as engineers and as people who pride ourselves in solving problems, it can be really awkward and uncomfortable to stay unsure and to stay discomforted. But I kind of want to give you a spoiler alert that persists. And really your persistence and your resilience is really what makes a difference there. In addition, another characteristic of this process is that it's very cyclical, right? So you'll find yourself addressing things that you thought you've already addressed. You find yourself unpacking things that may be uncomfortable consistently, right? So I definitely suggest that you have a community of people that you can talk to, but also suggest that you have a therapist and somebody that's trained to kind of help you unpack how these things might feel. I know therapists and therapy have its own stigma, but I would encourage you to kind of push past those things and give yourself the space to process these things. Because it usually directly affects your identity and can therefore be a little uncomfortable. It also requires the skill of being able to zoom in and zoom out, right? So they're going to be really micro experiences, almost anecdotal, where you're like, oh, that email was weird, or that interaction was weird. And that's going to take you to a place of reflection, which is going to make you uncomfortable, but eventually you're going to find yourself like at this 10,000 foot view where you're thinking about historic and systemic discrimination, right? And it's going to be really weird to go from these macros to these micros. So I just want you to be aware that happens. It's going to be a lot of like big picture, small picture, big picture, small picture. And that's natural and necessary. You're also going to find yourself continuing to learn about other experiences, right? And perspectives that you might not think exist, perspectives that might not have initially been valuable to you, but you'll hear as you continue to engage about things that are completely outside of your purview, right? And I think sometimes if you're aware and ready to be surprised, it's a little bit easier to ride those surprises. The biggest surprise I find is that you will have to deal with some of these implicit power structures, right? And this idea that people's experiences in that micro to macro are not happening in a vacuum. They're often supported by structures and institutions of power that you can't necessarily do anything about, right? So unearthing these power structures can be really uncomfortable, but that's a part of the process and very necessary. And as you do that, you're going to discover more privileges. We didn't give a strong definition for privileges at this go round, but what I understand privileges to be are things that might be unearned or things that you have worked for that still create some type of discrimination experience for other people. And that can be really uncomfortable, especially when there are things that you can't do anything about or when there are things that you need, right? So the privilege of being an engineer, the salary associated with it, the power associated with it, that's not necessarily something you want to give away or give up, right? So when you're encountering experiences or ideas that conflict with that, it can be intellectually and emotionally really difficult to process, which is why having community, having somebody to talk to about that would be great. So here are some strategies for mitigating unconscious bias. I definitely suggest that you start by learning about yourself and the types of problems that might come from yourself. And that's why we did a little bit of practice of that in our session today, right? We talked about what experiences have you had where you were unconsciously biased against somebody, right? It's always best to start at home with these things so that as you meet other people, you have your own version of things, but also you kind of know where the boundaries of your identity and your experiences are. 2, you want to start thinking about who you might want to influence. So is this your employees or even other people you work with? Start thinking really intentionally about as you're noticing these things and as you are starting to want to do something about this, what networks do you have, right? What power do you already have that you can use? And how can you engage with these people so that you're not necessarily just guilt tripping them or just creating a shameful experience, but that you're creating something generative that they can work on. And we'll come back to this because it's not simple. You also want to make sure that you're aware of the dangers associated with this. So a lot of times people do this kind of work if they come to this kind of workshop, like, oh, I want to do this all the time, right? And we forget about how psychologically unsafe this could be for certain people. We also forget about how financially unsafe this can be, right? If you make the wrong person uncomfortable and you're no longer able to collaborate, you're no longer able to get grants, that can have a real tangible experience on your life, right? So as you're collaborating, you want to make sure that you're sensitive to those things. If you think about kind of how I designed this session today, a lot of this was to be careful around what conversations I allow you to have with each other, right? Because you have to keep working with each other. I don't want you to create situations where you know, oh, now I know how this person's thinking, I don't want to work with them anymore. Like that can become problematic. So the same thing will happen as you develop your action plans and continue to work with each other. The best you can do usually is to model the habits and behaviors for yourself, especially if you find yourself with a lot of privilege or a lot of power. Sometimes there might be a series of programs you can do, there might be some conversations you can have, but at the minimum, there's always some type of example that you can be, right? So if you find yourself learning, if you find yourself coming across new concepts and just sharing what your experience has been, sharing what it was like for you to learn and what it was like for you to be uncomfortable, that goes a long way, right? And modeling what it means to experience this discomfort or to zoom in and zoom out, even though you might not be presenting solutions, you're showing other people the tools that you're using to do this work. I do want to give some notes on this because, like I said, it's not simple. As you are identifying people to collaborate with or people to work with or people you even want to address or people you want to change, it is important for you to understand how the power dynamics exist. There's this concept of target and agent identities that's really crucial to a lot of social work. And this idea is essentially that target identities are people who are on the receiving end of some discrimination, right? So if you have a target identity, you might find yourself excluded from things. You might find yourself experiencing some of the bad side of these things. If you have an agent identity, you're not necessarily experiencing the problem, right? So you have access to power, resources, and you feel like an insider. As we think about the reflections we've done today, if you found it difficult to think about experiences of discrimination, or if you found it difficult to think about places in which somebody else's biases impacted you, that might be because you have a lot of agent identities, right? But these things are not separate from sorry, these things are not separate from intersectionality, right? So just because you have one Asian identity does not mean that you don't also carry target identities, right? So my target identities are me being African American, me being a woman, but my Asian identities are, me being American, me being an English speaker. But that changes per context, right? I'm in Detroit right now, and though nationally me being Black is the target identity in Detroit, there's a lot of agency I have because I have a lot of predominantly Black spaces, right? So these things are not kind of black and white that way. But what I want you to know about this is that it's important to be aware of which identities you have that are targets and which identities you have that are agents, because typically, psychologically, it's hard for these different groups to communicate across. So in the training that I experienced about how to facilitate difficult conversations, the first thing they taught us is that if you find yourself in a mixed group where there are people who have target and agent identities across the same identity, you never really want to have targets trying to speak to agents, right? So when we think about the issue of gender, right? Sometimes it's hard for men to hear from women about what their experience has been, because from an agent standpoint, I'm not really sure if you're just saying that because you want to make me feel bad, or if this is actually a real experience I need to listen to. Though there is bias wrapped up in that, that is kind of how people's brains function, right? So it's important for you to be really intentional about the allyship that you create, but also when you find yourself with an Asian identity, that's a point at which you can use that privilege, right? Because I know that other male colleagues will hear me differently because I'm a guy. Is that fair? Is that right? Not necessarily. And is that something that you can exploit forever? No, right? But that is something that is a power that you can leverage to say, okay, if I'm aware of these things, and if I have some care about what the target of my identity might be experiencing, then I can use that agency to empower other agents to do something, or at least to empower them to be aware, right? So when we think about some of these strategies, when you're choosing what people you want to convey to, you do want to be aware of where their target or agent identity lands, right? I'm saying this because I don't want us to get into a place where we put the whole movement on our back and we, in our target spaces, are trying to change agents' minds by ourselves, right? I also don't want us to be in a place where, as agents, we're talking at targets, trying to get them to just feel differently, right? Target and agent identities have a lot to do with power, and it's important as you're mitigating this bias, as you're doing this work kind of at scale, that you're considering where does the power lie, which identities do I have that have more power in this context, and which identities do I have that have less power, okay? Now, I personally think this is super key and super important. However, I do want to make sure that we progress through the material. So I'm not going to harp on this too much longer. But if you have any questions, or if this still isn't sticking, if you could drop it in the chat, that would be great. Or if you want to just kind of raise your hand, and I can give a little bit more example here. It looks like it's still kind of digesting. We're still thinking. That's fine. I'm going to give you a way to deal with it. Yep, so target and agent is contextual, but it's contextual in a macro kind of sense, right? So in a micro space, like I said, for me in Detroit, and in a lot of Black spaces, me being Black is sometimes an agent, right? I have access to more community, access to more resources because this community is really Black, right? But in a micro sense, that's true. In a macro sense, this community being really Black does not necessarily mean that we have social and political power, right? So though my target identity is kind of agent-like in Detroit, in the macro sense, it's still target, right? Because we still don't necessarily have the same voting rights. We still experience redlining. We still experience big systemic things. So if there was like a scale of 1 to 10 of complicated things that I'm sharing with you today, target and agent identities is like on the 10 side, right? So if it takes a minute for you to wrap your head around it, that's completely understandable, because it's not binary. It doesn't necessarily map perfectly in different spaces. Okay. So now I want to give you a moment to think about yourself, right? To think about what identities do you have that are target identities, and what identity do you have that are agent identities? And remember this idea of intersectionality, right? So the lines might not necessarily be clear and stay clear in all contexts, but thinking about yourself and the work that you want to do, what do you want to see addressed, and where do those power experiences lie? And this actually takes us into our last activity. So thinking about the change we want to do and how we might collaborate. So what we're going to do is Megan's going to drop a link in the chat to a Word document. This Word document is like a virtual worksheet for us to think through these things. And what you're going to do is you're going to click on that link, and then you're going to go to File and Download, and you're going to take the Word document onto your computer. For right now, we're going to focus on just part 1. So I do want to show what that link looks like. So for me, because I created it, I can edit it as it exists. But for you, when you get here, it's going to be like a lot of these editing things are going to be grayed out. You're going to go to File, Download, and then you want to make sure you download it as a Word document. Then once you do that, you should be able to open it. Patience with technology. So what you're downloading is your action plan, and it starts with the question I just asked you. So thinking about what your target and agent identities are. I have another definition of what these identities are. So remember, target identities experience things as outsider. They might not necessarily have all the power. Agent identities do have power, and they feel like they're inside of the system. For today's activity, I would probably suggest that you keep this focused on your identities within academia, right? Because this can blow up if you try to think about it in all your social spheres. So you're going to take about 5 minutes here to think about what pieces of your identity are targets and what pieces of your identity are agents. So this could be gender, this could be race, this could be even discipline, right? Because we do know that there's a hierarchy sometimes in engineering of which engineering discipline people respect. This could also be tenure, like your tenure identity. So if you've been doing this for 20 years, you might feel like you have some agency in that. If you've just started, you might feel like, oh, I'm a newcomer, I don't have a lot of power. And then even thinking about the UC university structure, right? Unfortunately, certain universities are respected in certain ways. So if you feel like, I'm at a university that gets a lot of funding, that gets a lot of respect, that could be an agent, or I'm at a university where we're constantly fighting to be respected, or we're constantly fighting for inclusion, that could also be a target identity. So this activity, I think I want to give you about 5 minutes to do so. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Just so you know, I'm not going to ask you to turn this in. You don't necessarily have to share this with anybody, so feel free to be as honest as you'd like to be. But it is important for you to start just by identifying where do you have agency and where are you more of a target of that identity. Any questions or any issues downloading the document so far? Okay. So Megan, let's put 5 minutes on the clock and share some music. If you finish before the timer is up, if you can just raise your hand or do something so I know that you're done, that would be great. Okay. So thank you all for your reflection so far. I will say that there are a lot of different ways that you can do this type of reflection. Megan has a whole like positionality worksheet that addresses these things as well. So I'll make sure that we share those resources. She also has shared some other resources in the chat. So if you want to kind of unpack these things more, you can. Now we're going to move on to part two. So part two asks you to continue to unpack these target and agent identities. So for your target identities, I want you to reflect on what type of self-care or communal healing do you think would be helpful for you? You can think about just the identities you have on the sheet, but you can also think about some of the experiences of bias or discrimination that you've shared earlier. So what do you think would be helpful for you? What do you think would help you to either be able to process or to create some type of change in these spaces? And then for your agent identities, think about what types of biases you feel comfortable addressing. If it's an agent identity, obviously you're not necessarily experiencing the discrimination, so there might be some power that you have. And within that power set, where's your comfort zone? What do you feel comfortable speaking up to? This could be at a few different levels, right? This could be, I feel comfortable addressing the colleagues of mine that I'm already close to, that we already have these kind of conversations with. This could be, I feel like I want to push myself a little bit out of my comfort zone and start to talk to people who might have more power. But I do want to give you a minute to think about where do you feel comfortable as an agent, and then as a target, what type of healing or what type of help would be useful for you. So part two starts right below part one. It should be highlighted in green. And once again, you're not turning these things in, so no need to spell check, no need to be perfect in these things. I am going to give about 10 minutes for this. So Megan, if you could start another timer. And again, like you've been doing with the first part, once you finish early, or if you finish early, let me know in the chat. If you are an overachiever and want to move on to the next part, you can. If you just want to take a moment to take a deep breath, if you finish early, please feel free to do that as well. Okay. So it looks like people have finished part 2. I think I might have planned a little too much time, but I didn't want to assume that everybody would be moving quickly. So if you're done, that's great. We're going to move on to the next part. If not, feel free to take your time. I mean, obviously, this document is yours to come back to. Okay. So you were thinking about what type of healing you would like to see, but also what type of work you feel comfortable doing. Now we're going to think about what resources do we have related to that. So part 3 is all about thinking about those steps. So for your target identities, you want to think about what resources or community do you already have that can support you or have been supporting you. What are some requests you can make, or where would you like to create more community? And then you're going to think about how, if at all, you would like to see agents involved. So whatever your target identity is, think about what the agent version of that identity is and what would you like that type of collaboration or involvement to look like. And then for your agent identities, you're thinking about what do you still want to learn? What do you still feel like you need to learn? And then who else can you learn with? Really thinking about other agents, but are there other people that you know might be interested in this, or the people that you know kind of have a similar mindset to you that you might want to learn with? And then who else can you collaborate with? So I'm going to give you, let's maybe just do 5 minutes this time since we're moving a little quickly. To do part 3 should be highlighted in blue. You just scroll up the document, you should be able to get access to it. Any questions before we put the timer back up? No? Okay. If this feels a little uncomfortable, or it feels like it's dragging on, or you feel like you're not exactly sure how you're going to use this, I do encourage you to be patient and trust the process a little bit. We'll talk about what can be done with this. Yeah, so we're going to do 5 minutes now. If you need more time than that, we're going to check in 5 minutes. So don't feel like you have to finish in 5 minutes. Take your time, but I don't want to give too much time. Okay. So Megan, feel free. Oh, it's pink now. That's nice. Okay, if you're still working on part 3, continue. If you're done and you have any questions or things you want to share, this would be a good time. Liz, I see that you're having thoughts and questions. You're muted if you're talking. I'd love to hear if you want to share any of those.
I mean, I think it's really useful for me. It's okay if I talk out loud, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, you just said, okay. It's really useful for me to think about this sort of metaphor of target and agents, but it's also because I'm often in spaces where people have different amounts of power and I, at this point in my career, I feel as if I have a lot of power in a lot of spaces. And I'm often thinking about how to diffuse that or how to give it away. And I guess that's one of the things I want to learn more about how to manage that
Yeah.
space.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and it can be really difficult and sometimes impossible to give away power. Sometimes you can share it, sometimes you can, use that to create space for others. But that's definitely something that I think in community you can come up with some solutions and some methods of how to share that power. Does anyone else have thoughts or reflections that are coming up as they were completing parts 1 through 3? So we're going to move on to part 4, which I think it gives you a little bit more to hold on to, and it's also something that I'm going to ask you to take outside of this workshop. So part 4 is all about creating some absurdly small steps. I call them absurdly small because they don't necessarily need to completely map on to like addressing everything that you've come up with. We're not going to jump to the Jamboard just yet. We're going to stay in the Word document. So I want you to think about how you've answered part 3. So the communities you want or the people you like to talk to, and what are some small steps you can take towards those communities, right? So that could be sending an email, or maybe a text message. That could be all the way as big up to like trying to organize a collective or some additional conversations. But try to keep them as small as you can, right? So what are some absurdly small next steps from some of the communities that you identified or some of the work that you might want to do? And then you're gonna think about what timeline makes sense, right? So I want to make sure that you give yourself time to process, still on these things, maybe look at some other resources, some of the things that we shared. But I want you to be able to move to part C, which is what parts of your plan or who can you share your plan with to create some accountability. I think a lot of times when we come to workshops like this, we have some great thoughts, we have some great ideas, and then they kind of die until they come up again, right? So how can we create some support or some additional accountability so that these things actually become real for you? That timeline can help, right? Giving yourself a deadline by which you want to send that text message or a deadline by which you want to have reviewed those resources. But then also who can you talk to create some accountability in that, so I know a lot of times when I'm working on these things, I'll involve a friend and I'll set a date, right? So we'll at this date, maybe 2 or 3 weeks in the future, we're going to check in about these resources, right? If that's just saying, yeah, I read it and this is what I learned, that's great. We want to make sure that we keep these things manageable, right? Because I know we all have full-time jobs and stuff to deal with. But sometimes thinking about what are some breadcrumbs that you can do that can lead you back to these thoughts will be really helpful. So that's part 4. I'm going to give you, it says 10 minutes, so I think we're going to do 5 minutes again because that seems to have been working. Think about some absurdly small steps, and then we're going to come back and share those out, or the steps that you feel comfortable sharing. I'm going to share those with the group. Any questions before we start the timer again? Okay. Megan, let's start the timer. 5 more minutes. I'm going to go to 2:50. 4:50 our time, but 2:50 you guys' time. So now we get to the fun part. So you've thought about your identities, you thought about some of the things you feel comfortable doing, some of the community you might want. And now I want to give us a little bit of time to share that out. So you have a couple ways of engaging. Of course, if you're not comfortable, feel free to kind of sit and stew on it. But in order to foster a network of at least the people who are on this call with us today, I did want to give you some time and space to share out some of your absurdly small steps. So there's a link that Megan just drops into the chat what I want you to do is go to that link and copy and paste some of your absurdly small steps into the Jamboard. If you feel comfortable and if you'd like to develop community in this room, you can feel free to add your name and maybe your email address here. But if not, you can just add your steps, right? So people can see some examples of some of the absurdly small things we're doing towards these efforts. We're not going to spend 13 minutes on this. We don't have 13 minutes. I think I'm just going to give you all maybe 2 or 3 minutes to copy and paste your small steps in there. There's space for, I think, about 3 people per page. And if you want more space, you can just go to the next page. So this is what it looks like. You kind of just click into a box, add your name here, and then you can paste your steps down here. And then there are more pages here. My hope is that this can be a little bit of a souvenir and something that you all continue to work through and come back to after this call. But you also have your action plan on your desktop as well, right? So if you want to hold yourself accountable that way, I do highly suggest that there is at least some other person that you talk to about these things. It would be nice if you had somebody in your community or somebody who's also working at your institutions with you. But even if it's just a friend or a colleague or somebody outside of your institution to be aware of the work that you're trying to do, that level of community can make a world of difference in doing this work. So I'm gonna be quiet for a couple minutes and just give you some time to copy and paste. Once you finish, feel free to start looking through other people's absurdly small steps and feel free to plagiarize. So if you see somebody with a step that you think would be good for you, feel free to copy and paste. This is one of the few times in academia that plagiarism actually might be helpful, right? And it's a good thing. So I'm gonna give you a minute to review your steps and share them on the Jamboard. Okay. So I see a lot of really cool next steps in the Jamboard. Some of them are more involved than others. They're all really important and really necessary. As we continue to do this work, I ask that you give yourself a lot of grace. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of discomfort, a lot of like complex thinking involved in these things. So give yourself grace. Don't feel like you need to do everything today. Of course, on a Friday evening, this is not necessarily the best version of your brain to be doing a lot of this with. But feel free to connect with others. So I do want to give you a little bit of time to review the other responses in this board, to connect either through this conversation or afterwards. And also I want to give you all some space just to share kind of where you're at. So if you want to share some of your absurdly small steps, feel free to unmute yourself and do that. If you have any remaining questions or thoughts, this is a good time for that. We have about 4 minutes left together. And I would encourage, if you haven't shared, that you kind of push yourself to share a bit.
I'll share that. This is Rob. I didn't really, I knew that there would be things that would be revealed to me today, to myself and from the others, but a lot more was revealed to me than I expected. I didn't feel equipped to really, like, I don't know anything. And now I have a couple of good ideas, and I think I might even be comfortable sharing spaces in this term coming up.
Awesome. That's good to hear. Thank you so much for that, Rob. I will say I had a similar experience putting together this presentation. It's like, I don't really know what I'm going to say. I do a lot of stuff like this, but everyone I try to tailor specifically to who I'm working with. And the target and agent stuff, I don't typically share because I feel like it's a little advanced. But for this, it felt really necessary because I didn't want to send you out into the world assuming that you could talk to anybody about anything. So I was kind of surprised about the activity that came up associated with that. Anyone else? I see some smiles happening. Steve, would you like to share? Not to put you on the spot.
Well, I think sometimes just being aware of all the sectionalities that can occur in a classroom and trying to address them all, it can feel overwhelming. And so I think it just needs some general guiding principles of empathy and respect, and also probably some self-grace or self-forgiveness, and letting go of perfectionism.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot of humility baked into a lot of these things that's necessary. And that's why I think it's really important to think about what communities in which you can be that humble and have that grace. Because a lot of times I think we notice a thing and then we jump to, let me go do something about it, right? Let me go talk to the people who are being disenfranchised, or let me go force my students to deal with this. And sometimes you just need some colleagues and some people who are also on the same kind of status as you to practice these things, to get these things out. Because it's going to be messy at first. It's going to be really, really messy.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Anyone else like to share? Either steps, things that landed, things that you're still struggling with? Okay. No pressure. I'm okay with what awkward silences. I do know that we're at 6 o'clock. So I'm open to staying on for a few more minutes if anybody has questions. Please do be aware that there is going to be an evaluation survey sent out to you all, so you can tell us how these things land on you. We also will share the slides for this, so you can come back to these things.
Yeah, I think I actually already emailed everybody the survey questions, and I appreciate your time and Chanel for doing this great seminar. I was quiet, I was silent, I didn't say much, but I think I need to go back. Not all the terms that was used are familiar to me, so I feel like I have to go back and just read it a little bit more and do more practice to get more comfortable with it. But everything was designed in a very well manner. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining today. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I do want to address a couple questions that have come up If you want to stay on, feel free. If you have to leave, we won't take it personally. Thank you all so much. One thing I think I would do differently in the future is to bring up the target and agent identities earlier, just so that we can better see the connection between these and the bias and identities. I think typically what I've seen or what happens is that Asian identities tend to have more unconscious bias in a lot of ways, as in it's hard for them to one see themselves as an agent, but also hard for them to identify what the target experience might be. Especially when we think about positionality, like the function of you being an agent is that there's a lot of resources that are kind of invisible to you, that sometimes get co-opted as like, this is just what people are, this is just what people have, this is just what it should be. When in reality, that's not the experience for a lot of people. And to me, the value of the target agent metaphor is to be able to make that more explicit. So I would definitely like to explore that more. And I think if I was to do this specific type of workshop again, I would try to make that connection earlier. So thank you so much for that question. Because even as I was doing it, I was like, I hope that this isn't too backhanded or too like, coming in a little too late. So I appreciate you all for engaging with that.
Thank you again. We greatly appreciate your time.
Yeah, and if you want to contact me, LinkedIn worked. I also am constantly checking my email inbox, so that's a great way to interact with me as well. I've done similar workshops. I did one that was kind of around the difference between intent and impact. I did those with a lot of, I think it was Cal Poly professors, and I think that workshop I've done a lot more and is a little bit more concrete. So if you want some examples of that, you can reach out for that as well.
How do we download the chat? I didn't know we can do that.
Yeah, so if you look in the open chat where you see like to everyone type message here, there's 3 dots. If you click the 3 dots and click save chat, then you'll have that on your desktop.
Oh,
Yeah, we're not sure. So I was under the impression that when you save chat, people's private chats don't come up, and then Megan was under the opposite impression. So we're not entirely sure which one works. I will ask if you are able to see private chats, that you would ignore them so that people can keep their anonymity. That's the best I think we can do. But I'm pretty sure they don't come up.
I would have to leave now.
Okay, thank you so much for coming.
thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions or things we can address before we drop off? I know we're a little over time here, but I thank you all so much for staying over to the after party here.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for doing this. It's great.
Awesome. Bye, guys. So nice to meet you.
Bye.
Have an excellent weekend. Stop recording.